Today's conversation is with Sarah Reece. She is a Professor of Evolutionary Parasitology at the University of Edinburgh, a member of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and the Director of the Reece Lab. She is conducting interdisciplinary research combining evolution and ecology, parasitology, and chronobiology to better understand malaria parasites from a novel perspective. Above all, it was delightful talking with her about a wide range of aspects of what life as a scientist is like. Here is our conversation with Sarah Reece.
So we'd like to start off just by having you tell us about your scientific experience and your career, what stands out for you over the years you've been doing it.
You guys have big questions that are actually surprisingly difficult to answer in a concise way. So I don't know, maybe shall I start by telling you sort of how I went from being at high school to where I am now, to give you an illustration of that trajectory.
Sure. Yeah.
So grew up in England, was at sixth form, which is, I guess, the equivalent of the stage you're all at. Doing my A-levels. At that point, you choose universities. I decided, for reasons I really don't understand anymore, that I wanted to be a vet. But turns out I wasn't smart enough to be a vet student. I didn't get the A-level grades that were necessary to take a place at vet school. So I was scrabbling around, as the UK system allows you to do, looking for what degree course I might take as a plan B. You know, hadn't actually thought of a plan B until then, which is a bit embarrassing in hindsight. And zoology and marine biology kind of captured my interest as being kind of close to being a vet, you know, learning about animals. So, you know, very, very naive and young at that point. So I went off to Glasgow to do my undergrad and just got increasingly interested in evolution and ecology, and had some really great experiences in my undergrad. So I got to go on several expeditions to do wildlife conservation, and that really sort of showed me that there is a practical side to all this ivory tower academia stuff, which was really good, actually. But I was definitely more interested in understanding why creatures do things the way they do. That, I think, is the kind of the tagline that has run throughout everything I've been interested in up until now. So I was particularly interested in why animals or other organisms reproduce in the way they do. Why, you know, why do males compete like they do? Why are females choosy? How, you know, how does natural selection optimize the number and the sex of offspring that organisms have? Got interested in those kinds of questions, and so managed to get a PhD in Edinburgh to study what's known as sex allocation. And that's the allocation of a parent's resources to sons and daughters. So you probably are thinking, why is that interesting? Because every species is a 50-50 male to female sex ratio. Well, actually, that's really not true. There's loads of different taxa, insects, plants, mammals, birds, you name it, all kinds of things will have unequal numbers of sons and daughters for very interesting and really quite different reasons. So I studied that in my PhD and applied some of those concepts to malaria parasites. So up until then, before going to Edinburgh, I hadn't really studied anything about parasites or infection biology. And this was sort of revolutionary for me. The idea that you could basically apply all the learning that you get from watching David Attenborough documentaries about cool stuff that animals do. Well, turns out parasites do all of this stuff too in their own weird way. So that basically then made me start wanting to know, well, why do parasites do things the way they do? How do they live their lives? Why do they do things in those manners? And can we use this understanding to mess with them and control them better? And so, like I say, the explaining why things do what they do, it has been the kind of overarching thread to everything I've done. So at the end of my PhD, I knew that I wanted to carry on doing this with malaria parasites. There's so much research into malaria. You know, some extremely high quality research goes on in Sydney in malaria from people that I know, but it's all really focused on finding drugs or vaccine targets or understanding immune responses. It's all, you know, very much molecular details. Hardly anybody is looking at these kinds of bigger picture, whole organism type questions, treating parasites as evolving entities that have some agency, that natural selection can optimize their behaviors. You know, they're making decisions. They're not thinking about things, obviously, because they don't have brains, but they're still, in biological terms, making decisions about what they should do. So I managed to finish my PhD and get a grant to start my own lab. And that's pretty unusual to not have to do a postdoc. And it's become much harder to do that over the last decade. So I was one of the last few lucky people to be able to take that route. So I started my lab in 2005. And yeah, that's basically what I've been doing ever since, building and running a lab, asking questions about malaria parasites, evolution and ecology in sort of lots of different areas. So in terms of highlights, getting funding is amazing. It's interesting that the further up the food chain you get, by that I mean the more experienced you get at this, the less impact the successes have on you. And this is something I wasn't expecting. So, you know, you get your first grant and you're on cloud 9, you're drinking champagne for several days, because it is a massive achievement. But by the same token, all the disappointments hit you equally hard as well. You get your first paper that you think is worthy of Science or Nature harshly rejected, and you know, you're massively disappointed. And what I've realized is over the years, those highs and lows actually have massively evened out. So the disappointments don't hit you as hard, but also by consequence, the successes don't make as much of an impact either. So that's been an interesting evolution of highlights and lowlights, I'd say. Supervising PhD students is definitely a highlight. You know, seeing people come in underconfident, inexperienced, not really knowing which way is up. Within 3.5 years, they're pretty competent, independent scientists. That's really great. You know, at some point in everybody's PhD, and the point at which this happens varies, but you kind of see a light bulb go on where suddenly they just seem to get it. And you can't define what getting it actually is. It's just somehow they seem to operate in a different way. They're starting to see the wood from the trees. They've acquired that critical grasp of interrogating data and really seeing what it means. And that's really rewarding. And obviously supervisors like to take lots of credit for that, but that's probably it's probably a bit of a push. Other great things about the career are, you know, you get a lot of opportunities to travel. My line of work, evolution and ecology, there's a huge amount of fieldwork opportunities. So you can go to far-flung, exciting places, see lots of really amazing stuff. Even if you don't do fieldwork, still amazing conference opportunities and opportunities to visit labs worldwide to learn new skills, which is really, really great. So, you know, it's such a varied career with so many opportunities, and you get a lot of satisfaction, I think, from carving it out for yourself and seeing that none of this has been handed to you on a plate. You've made it all happen. So yeah, I guess those are some highlights. Does that make any sense? Or
Yeah.
Can you see these things from where you're, you know, the point in your careers that you guys are at? Does it make sense that this is how it is?
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that in terms of studying malaria, you have a lot of research that goes into like the molecular biology at a very small scale, whereas you've sort of taken like a larger scale view, looking at the organism itself. So that branching away, does it make it harder for you to like have your research like accepted in the community, like because it's not following what the flock is doing? Like how is that for you?
Oh God, how long have you got for me to rant?
Oh, as long as you want. This is great.
Yeah, I mean, you have. So, okay, so let me put the positive spin on it first. So
Sure.
what we do in my lab is really interdisciplinary. We do evolution and ecology, we do parasitology, and we do chronobiology. So we're mixing all these things. So we're studying the circadian rhythms of parasites and hosts in an evolutionary context. No other lab is messing with these three different disciplines and bringing them together. So we've got a niche. And if we can convince people that this niche is novel and important, then that's a big step towards getting funding, and so far that has worked out reasonably well. So that's a great thing about doing interdisciplinary work, is it is novel, and a lot of funding agencies and universities have recognized that interdisciplinarity is where the future is at. A lot of the big unanswered questions aren't going to be solved by people within a specific discipline. We need people coming together with different perspectives. So that's all great. So there's a lot of goodwill for it. Actually having it accepted and breaking away from the usual mold is fucking hard. Often I think we're pissing into the wind, as one of the phrases I like to use to describe some of the challenges. Part of the problem is, even, within biology, the different disciplines in biology, you get immersed in different terminologies. And it's very difficult then to communicate across disciplines. And it's made even harder by the fact that the same terms can have completely different definitions across disciplines. So if I say to someone, talk about something at the level of a population, as an evolutionary biologist, I'm talking about a group of interbreeding individuals. A parasitologist will define a population as a bunch of parasites within a single host. So that's clearly a different definition. A bioinformatician might say that a population is something like a bunch of different expression profiles or something. So it's really hard to communicate complex ideas and concepts across disciplines in a way that can make sense to people that aren't used to thinking in the same way as you. And that difficulty is compounded by the fact that when you write a paper, your hope is that people across all relevant disciplines may have some interest in reading it. So what you say has got to make sense to all these different kinds of people. It's not really, I feel it's not the right way to go to write a paper to one discipline. I feel that that's missing the importance of interdisciplinary work, and we should be making an effort to communicate broadly, but that's really hard. Sometimes it works for us, sometimes it doesn't. A lot of the time, our papers get viewed as it's too malaria to be interesting for evolution and ecology. And a lot of the malaria people view our work as just weird and pointless because we're not coming out with a protein that could be viewed as a drug target. So that's quite difficult. A lot of the time, we also have problems with editors of journals. So on the rare occasions where I think we have something that could go to a fancy journal, editors just reject it outright because they're not used. Well, I mean, it might be that the work is crap. This is always a potential problem, but let's sweep that aside. I think a lot of the problem is that they're not used to seeing stuff like that. If something comes in on malaria, they want it to be on human malaria, not a model system, and they want it to be very directly related to health, not potentially asking a broader question. I mean, sometimes it's really frustrating. So I'll give a talk at a conference and a journal editor will email me and say, so that topic you were talking about, that study that you presented, do you think you'd be interested in submitting it to our journal? And I'm like, yeah, I did. You rejected it without sending it to review. So, they like the sound of it, but then when it comes to them, they don't know what to do with it. So that's quite frustrating, I have to say.
Is there a way to break away from that? Or is it completely out of your control? Or is there just too many people that are against it?
Yeah.
What do you do about it? Or just have to make it so good that you can just stick it to them and say, well, this deserves to be published and done more. How do you do it?
It's really difficult. I mean, having a big name, I think, would help because I'm sorry to say that there is still very much of a kind of old boys club in the world of scientific research. So, and I don't think I really have the skills to engage with that. So I'm not very good in that department. I mean, and like I say, it's really hard to know, like just because I think something's brilliant doesn't mean that everybody else in the world will, because I could be wrong. So, I mean, this is going to sound a bit arrogant, and I don't mean it to come out this way, but what comforts me is that I don't tend to write big grants very often, and my success rate of getting grants is about 80%. So that's quite high. And so I don't tend to write a big grant unless I think I've got a really good new idea. So that suggests that, to get 80% of applications funded, there must be something good about the science that my lab is doing. But perhaps when we actually do it, we don't do it very well, or we don't write about it very well. Those things may be possible. So it might not be entirely the system. It's very difficult to know. I mean, in terms of breaking the system, getting it to be more accepted. I mean, it's a lot of the times it's getting past the editors of journals, because the actual academic reviewers of papers, generally speaking, quite like what we do, and often the reviews are fairly favorable. We've never, I'm trying to think, I can't think of any occasion where reviewers have said, we think there's a hole here that you should do this experiment to fill, and we've had to go away and do it. So we've never actually had to radically alter a paper to get it published in the end. So I don't know. I think it is just, it's a lack of familiarity with this sort of stuff, and hopefully it will erode over time. And it's just one of those cultural things that has to evolve. But yeah, if I could think of a way to accelerate that process, I'd be very keen to.
Yeah. So there's certain attributes that I feel like makes us better scientists. In your own words, could you tell us who you consider a scientist to be, and perhaps what attributes or qualities does that encompass or make them a better scientist?
So I'm going to do what I do when I write a grant, and I'm going to pretend to be someone else. So my ideal scientist that I would like to be when I grow up is, you've got to have really high, these are in no particular order of importance. You've got to have really high attention to detail. That's really crucial. You've got to cross all the T's and dot all the I's of your research. It's got to be watertight. You've got to see the issues with it for yourself. You've got to conduct things extremely thoroughly, measure things properly several times. You've got to have ultimate confidence in your data, and you've got to give people that you're working with confidence in your data as well. So really high attention to detail. You've got to be really creative. People often don't think that science is creative, but I think it is. And the reason I think it's creative is because the best science is addressing novel problems, or addressing big, long-standing problems in novel ways. So you've got to have some imagination to figure out what those questions are and how you can tackle them in a better way than people have done before. So I think there's a lot of creativity that comes into that. You have to be confident as well. I would say I spent 2 decades faking it till I made it, in terms of the acquisition of self-confidence. But you have to be able to stand up for yourself to a certain degree, and have faith in what you're doing and stick with it as well. So you do need drive, motivation, and confidence. You need to be curious, because you need to be interested in what you're doing. Because the brilliant thing about science is you can do what you want. If something is interesting to you, you can pursue it. So you've got to know what you're interested in. Yeah, creativity, attention to detail, confidence, imagination, and interest in stuff. Ability to work hard, obviously, but that goes with any kind of big career, I'm sure. Yeah, and well, actually, ability to get on with people and work with people is really important in my lab, because what we do is pretty complicated. We're dealing with animals, we're dealing with mosquitoes, we're dealing with parasites. So we have to operate as a big team. So even though people have their own separate research projects, everybody clubs together to help someone with their experiments, because they'd just be too big for one person to carry out. And this is, I think, another feature of interdisciplinary work, is that people have to be able to work together to do it. So you've got to be somebody that is cooperative and a good team player to do that. I think the days where you can be a single theoretician sitting in your office working away for your entire career are kind of falling by the wayside now, as in modern science.
Mm-hmm.
Does that dovetail with what other people have said are attributes of scientists, or have I come up with a slightly different list?
No, well, those are all great qualities, and also what we've come across with other people is generally scientists state that there's simply way too many attributes for scientists to have to be sometimes defined as a few. Those are the sorts of answers we've come across most, but that's very interesting to hear as well. So what do you think motivates you to be a scientist?
Like I said earlier, you guys have really big, really hard questions. I don't know. I just do it. Yeah, and at some point when I was running my first grant, somebody, a more senior scientist, in a random conversation said to me, I couldn't do anything else now because I couldn't be told what to do by anyone. And I realized, oh my God, I've also hit that point. I like being in charge of what I do. And so that's definitely a motivator to keep going. You know, I'm embarrassed to say, but that is true. I couldn't work for someone and be, you know, managed on a day-to-day basis anymore. I'm too stubborn. And like I say, this career gives you the freedom to do that. And I mean, I guess it just boils down to, I don't know why I do it, but I can tell you why I think I'm good at it. I think I'm good at it because I have a deep interest in a topic, and I've identified an angle that people think is important and under-researched. I think I'm good at science because I have a very strong desire to cross things off my to-do list. So I'm definitely known as somebody that's able to get shit done efficiently. And that's quite important when you're managing a big research group with a lot of stuff going on. The ability to coordinate and organize things is key. And I think I've become a reasonable communicator of the science. And I think that has come as a product of trying to communicate concepts from one discipline to different disciplines that aren't used to hearing or thinking about these things. So I think over the years, I've had to very much adapt the way I present my research so that people can have a vague chance of understanding it. I guess I do it because I enjoy it. So why do I enjoy it? I mean, you can't beat the thrill of finding out something new for the first time. And so that doesn't happen to me so much now, because the people in my lab are the ones finding the things out for the first time, because they're the ones doing the experiments and analyzing the data. But that is a massively big and amazing thing that I can't really imagine other careers can give you. You know, you discover something that no one else has ever figured out. It must be like discovering a 10-foot ichthyosaur fossil somewhere. You know, it must be similar to that. And the further I've gone in my career, the more important it has been to me to train people as well. So that's definitely a big facet in the enjoyment factor.
On that note, you mentioned that your lab's already, like, you've over the years gotten better at communicating your science, and your lab's already been involved in a lot of a lot in influencing younger students at school. I was wondering, like, how do you think this can be improved overall for both like educators and students?
Yeah, that's a really cool thing to talk about, actually, because so there's lots of things about scientific research that I think are changing rapidly. One is the women in science aspect of it is becoming, that there are more of us finally. So that's a big deal. Interdisciplinarity is a big deal, and another big deal I think is public engagement. And so my lab, people in my lab have done 90% of this, so I cannot take credit for hardly any of what they've been doing, which is amazing, but I'll tell you about it. So we've got a grant to take lots of learning activities to rural primary schools in Scotland. So these are schools that aren't near big cities, so they don't have ready access to universities and academic research like city schools often have. So what we want to do is take us as a team of scientists and visit the pupils in these schools to help them experience what doing lab science is like. So we've got some simple sorts of experiments and investigations that they can do in their classrooms that we've been developing over the last sort of 10 to 15 years by visiting schools, going to science fairs and stuff like that. So we've had a lot of prototypes for these activities, and we finally put them together into a proper program that we are on the verge of rolling out as it happens. The first major visit to schools, hopefully COVID allowing, will happen towards the end of February. So what's great is lots of funding agencies are very keen to put money into supporting this. Could obviously still be more to be able to do things better. The problems and the obstacles I see in this are, one, scientists are not trained in this area. So everything we know about school curriculums and engaging with primary school kids is stuff we've picked up ourselves and had to extract from working with teachers and education authority people. We've had no training. We didn't know what we didn't know, if you know what I mean. So there needs to be more of an interface, I think, to facilitate scientists who have a good idea and want an enthusiasm to do something, but don't know how to be deployed because we have no training and are ignorant in those areas. If there was an interface of people that could facilitate this and train us in the ways that we need to be trained, then that would be super helpful as well. The other big obstacle, I think, is still a problem with the academic system, in that it's still old-fashioned enough that your sort of career success and your promotion prospects are still very much biased towards your research achievements. So anything you do that isn't directly related to publishing papers takes away from your success in your career as perceived by promotion people and university higher ups and so on. And that is changing. There's appetite to change it, but there's no meaningful mechanisms in place to change that. So if there were, and these kinds of outreach activities and other initiatives were actually genuinely, tangibly valued, that would really encourage more people to be doing that kind of thing, I think. Does that make sense? Is this all a bit?
Yeah. Especially that last point, I think is very interesting. Any personal ways around that you've seen, or any movements, any very specific movements?
So, good question. What is? I mean, there is a lot of virtue signaling. Really, there's a lot of, we have to write about what we do a lot. We produce reports on it a lot. The university is very keen that it happens, but still they all are kind of wanting it to happen on top of the normal workload. In terms of, and so that's, I mean, in terms of outreach and public engagement, at least having grants for doing it from funding agencies is a big step forward, rather than trying to fund it, out of existing grants in a sort of difficult way. In terms of the other areas of academia that are old-fashioned, things, so the Wellcome Trust, for example, they've recently changed to a new set of funding streams, and they've become increasingly concerned about these sorts of issues, especially issues surrounding research culture. So making sure that diversity and inclusivity in research culture exists for a start. And so in their applications for funding, they're particularly keen to evaluate people on their track record for mentorship. So, somebody that runs a lab where they put people on the same project and make them compete to get the big result, that's awful and shouldn't be allowed to happen. But there's been no mechanism to police it before. So at least things like the Wellcome Trust initiatives are going to be selecting against that sort of way of operating. And people that have a good track record of mentoring and supporting the people in their teams will hopefully be viewed more favorably for funding. So they're tiny, tiny gestures, really, but at least it's something.
Yeah. I guess you sort of gave a very good segue to our next question, and that's about the role of women in STEM. What is your perspective on the role of women in STEM now, and how do you think it's changing?
Yeah. How long have you got? Again, there's a long way to go still. Sorry, I'm being quiet because there's like 10 different ways to take this that are fighting in my brain. So maybe something that I probably most want to tell you about is, so I've become involved in a group called Women in Malaria. This is set up by a scientist called Elena Gomez Diaz, who lives in Spain. And she set this initiative up a few years ago to promote the careers of women researchers that are working on malaria parasites. And because this is a massive research field and it's globally spread as well. And malaria is a particularly good case study because it's a disease predominantly in LMIC's lower middle income countries. So much of the research is happening in LMICs, and also all of the efforts to control the disease are all being deployed in these areas as well. And the women scientists and the women technologists, the policymakers in these countries, they just have a massively hard time. We think that there's sexism and bias in more Western universities. It's nothing compared to what women in other in parts of the world face. So on the one hand, I feel I have absolutely no groundings to complain about any bias I may have experienced compared to what's happening in other places in the world. And again, these things have changed for the better and are slowly improving, but I kind of worry that we've been on a sort of an upswing of the curve to addressing the sex bias in academia, and there's going to be a kind of a plateau where actually things should be up here, but we can't quite find a mechanism to kick the problem fully into touch. And a lot of it, I think it's clear, a lot of it is now subconscious bias. People aren't actively discriminating, but we just can't seem to solve the subconscious bias problem. There's loads of studies that you give the same CV to two people, to the same person with two different names on it, and they rate it better if it's got a male sounding name on it. That's subconscious bias. How to solve that? Behavioral scientists should be telling us, I think, how to solve that. People are very much against positive discrimination. There's because it's so hard to get funding in academia, there are a few funding schemes I know of that are specifically for women, and there's a huge backlash against this because it's viewed as sexism against men. The Women in Malaria initiative we've had problems with because and I stress it's a minority of our interactions with men. But some people have felt like, so we've run a conference to showcase Women in Malaria where only anybody could attend this conference. It was run online, so there was no real charge for people to watch the talks. but all the speakers and all the session chairs were all women. And we did get some complaints that this wasn't fair. We'd excluded men unfairly from this. And it was sort of like, well, we have excluded men, yes, but we don't think it's unfair because, you know, if you look at the rate of attrition of women as they progress through their careers, it's still far, far higher than the rate of attrition for men. You know, and women still face far more obstacles in an academic career associated with a lot with caring responsibilities and lack of ability to travel and do these sort of extracurricular commitments like going to conferences because of their additional responsibilities that traditionally fall on women. You know, so we're just trying to redress that disparity to a small degree. And so there are men that want to be part of the initiative to support women, and that's amazing, and they are very welcome, and we're so grateful for them. But like I say, there are also men that feel that we've discriminated against them, and that it's equally bad in the wrong way. So yeah, I don't know, it's still a big mess as far as I can tell.
So it's still a big mess, but do you like have faith that it's moving into the right direction? Do you think that's the trajectory that's happening right now?
Yes, but like I say, I fear the rate of progress will get slower and slower, and
Right.
then there will remain a gap that can't be closed without serious some serious mechanisms for which.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's easy for me to say that because I don't know what the solutions are. It's clearly a complex problem with complex solutions, or we would have solved it already.
Yeah, of course. Well, I suppose on a related note, we sort of touched on it throughout the conversation, but what do you think?
One thing, I've just realised how negative that is, and another positive thing that I should point out is one of the ways it's moved in the right direction, and this is not just for women, but is that funding agencies now no longer just evaluate applications based on how many years post-PhD somebody is. They take into account, well, how many years are they in reality, given however long they may have had for career breaks for whatever reason. So that's really good. So that's definitely reduced a lot of the discrimination against people that have taken a year or several years off to look after their small children, for example. So that's definitely a big positive step.
Sure.
Not all doom and gloom. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no, I think I'm about to take it back to doom and gloom because our next question is because like we've talked like with other scientists as well. We've talked like all like really positive aspects of science. But we also want to know. I think we've touched on it. We want to know what some of the unpleasant aspects are. So, like, what do you think makes people quit, like along their journey? What are some of the things that stand out? Well, that's common that people have trouble with.
Okay, so people I know that have left science, it's a myriad reasons. A big one, and it depends on career stage. Some people are spat out of the system because they can no longer get funding. So if you're on, so there's routes to be a lab head. You can be employed by university as a lecturer type position where the university gives you your salary and then you bring in research grants to employ people to work in your lab. Or there are funding routes that also bring in your salary as well. So those are, in the UK, those are called fellowships. So you can apply for a big pot of money that will pay your salary and for research in your lab to happen. And then you choose a university that you will bring your fellowship to and they will host you. And so that's the situation I'm in. So I've been particularly, so divert from the doom and gloom. It's possible to do this because I've been particularly jammy in that I have been a fellow for over 15 years now. So that's very good. My university has not had to pay very much towards my salary. However, fellowships are pretty hard to get. They're pretty competitive. And if people come to the end of a fellowship and they aren't successful in another fellowship application, and if their university doesn't want to give them a permanent job and they can't find a permanent job in another university, then basically they just fall out of the system. So that's one reason that people leave. At an earlier stage, people in my lab have left academia because they've not fancied my job. I've obviously not made it look very attractive to them. They've not fancied being responsible for people. So there are 3 staff in my lab that have all been working with me for more than 12 years, and they're amazing. And, you know, I do feel responsible for continuing to get grants so they can continue to pay their mortgages. So it is a big responsibility, and that's quite a thing to face when you're a PhD student, thinking, oh my God, in 10 years, will I have to be doing that too? So that could be off-putting. Other people just want more security, you know, so the standard route is PhD, 1 or 2 postdocs of 3 years each, then try and find a job. And if you want to have a family, you know, that level of uncertainty about where you're going to be based for those postdocs, whether you're going to get another one, is not ideal to deal with that level of stress and uncertainty, especially if, you know, you want to do bigger things like have kids.
In that search, trying to find a job, like how difficult do you think it is for people to like land on research that they're passionate about, or like is it a case, like are there cases where people get stuck on something that they're not too excited about, not because of a contract for some reason, or just for the fact of having a job they get stuck in it? Like, does that happen at all?
I guess it must do. I don't think I know any of those people. I'd say that all the people I know are maybe that's going on in my lab and I just don't realize it. I'm now thinking
You're gonna talk to them now.
A really good impression of being super committed and super yeah, I mean, it can happen. And of course, you know, you can take a job on a topic you're interested in and realize that actually, no, your interests have developed into something else. You could also end up in a lab where you thought you'd be doing one thing, but actually by the time you get there, the lab head wants you to do something else. So, you know, but I'm sure that's the same as all careers. And there's still, I think, more flexibility, more potential for freedom and flexibility in science. You know, if my dream is somebody in my lab says, you know how to do this thing, and I want to ask this question that your lab hasn't really asked very clearly before. So I want to come and work with you to learn how to do this so we can open up this new topic. I'm like, brilliant, you know, that's amazing. I'll try and get you a grant. It's somebody that comes in with a cool idea that is going to be a nice person to work with. That's the dream. It's simple, but that's it. So if you get stuck doing something you don't want to do, then you're either in a lab with a poor research culture, or you've not tried very hard to turn it into something that you do want to do. Maybe. Right. That's maybe a bit harsh, but
in a sort of similar way, do you think competition nowadays, and perhaps before, do you think it gets in the way of science and scientific research, or do you think maybe it's a useful selection tool to remain with the top quality scientists, as it says? So.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't really experience competition because, like I say, nobody else thinks it's a good idea to do the things that we do. So, and that's partly what attracts me to it as well, to be perfectly honest, is we're doing these things in this other way. And part of what I like about that is that we're not in competition with people. We can collaborate with anybody. And that is what I like about science. I guess some people, if you're a silverback type personality, maybe you like competition and it drives you and you thrive on it, but I find it far too stressful, to be honest, and I think it does get in the way of doing good science. So like I say, doing interdisciplinary stuff is about cooperation and collaboration, which is the opposite. So that's where I think the future should lie.
Do you think there's a trend towards that, towards collaboration? Because it's something I've been hearing a lot, just speaking to other scientists. It's come up in every conversation. I've only heard good stories about collaboration. That's very exciting. So is this something that's like recognized across the board, and are people moving towards that?
Yeah, and funding agencies are really promoting it. So I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a massive upswing in the proportion of grants that are specifically for team projects as opposed to single lab projects. It's a lot harder to do successfully because, you know, ultimately one person has to be in charge, and you're trying to wrangle research teams in other universities who are maybe working on a project that isn't quite their core interest, but they're interested enough in it a bit to do some of the work on it. But you kind of got to kind of keep them interested enough in it so that they don't just spend all their time doing what their lab really wants to do. So it is a lot more challenging, which means that it's much higher risk for funding agencies to fund. I'm not sure whether they realize that or how they quantify this sort of stuff. But yeah, it's definitely recognized and is being increasingly supported. So that's good.
On a slightly different note, back to like a bit of a big picture question. If you don't mind, could you tell us about a life-changing or influential experience you've had throughout your career?
About, as in personal life or work life?
Work
Not
life.
necessarily in science, but
It
not
can be
necessarily
personal.
just science as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether I've had any major science events.
Perhaps about the Quantum magazine. I found that pretty exciting. Like learning that you were in the Quantum magazine. I personally was like, that would be, that's really insane to hear about. Like when I found that. Yeah.
Because, you know, I'd never heard of it before.
Yeah.
So I guess, I mean, yeah, stuff like that is nice. I guess this comes down to one of the things I said earlier, which is the more experienced and older you get, the more the highs and the lows dampen. And so that was an amazing experience for my PhD student, Mary, to be involved in that magazine article. But for me, it was kind of like same shit, different day. Because I've been on telly, radio and stuff like that before. So it wasn't that big a deal, I suppose. I mean, one interesting thing, sort of dovetailing back a bit to the women in science question, is having kids. So I was kind of keen to not have kids until I had a secure job. So it turned out that I waited really quite long, and basically I was a professor by the time I had my first child. So that's much longer than most people would wait, given the old biological clock situation. But what that's done to me in terms of my approach to research has been quite interesting to observe, because I didn't expect any change, let alone what to expect. But it's made me a lot more efficient. People say that a lot. And the way it's made me more efficient is I've become so much more grateful and interested and invested in the people in my lab and the research that we do. And the flip side of that is I've become so much less tolerant of administration and bureaucracy that I don't see the point in. Now, part of this might just be explained by getting more experienced and getting older, but I definitely noticed a massive step change in my attitude to these different aspects of my job when I came back from my periods of maternity leave. I'm far more likely to delete stuff that I don't think is worth doing than diligently deal with things. And I'm far more likely to take the time to invest in various different ways in the people that are in my lab. So that's been a massive life event that has had an impact on how I manage people. And I think it's made me a much more understanding person as well. Because having children makes you somewhat mentally broken. And so I think that just gives you a perspective that you can't expect everybody to be awesome all of the time, because you've proved to yourself that you are not. Which is a contrast to the key advice I was given as a PhD student about how to make it in academia. One of my PhD supervisors, who is a fantastically amazing person in so many respects, said to me, to make it in academia, you have to be impressive all of the time. I mean, can you imagine a more daunting, intimidating statement to make to a PhD student? So, you know, I went back and crawled under my rock. And that was when I decided, you know, okay, I'm gonna just try and fake it till I make it. Massive amounts of imposter syndrome came from that comment. So yeah, I think having kids makes you realize that you are not that. Nobody is that, and it's okay.
I was also wondering if you had any interesting new developments in your lab that you've come across recently, or any new research that you found really exciting.
So one of the so I think one of the coolest things we've shown quite recently is that malaria parasites have some ability to count themselves. So I don't know if you know about bacterial quorum sensing, but bacteria live together in social groups. They have really complex social lives, and a lot of what they do in terms of maybe how bad the infection is they cause to somebody is based on how closely related the bacteria living inside a person are. So they'll work together if they're closely related, and they'll undertake various crazy warfare schemes if they're not related to one another, and so on. Is totally amazing. And so we've been asking, well, are malaria parasites capable of their versions of this kind of stuff? And yeah, it seems that they are. They seem to know how well they're getting on during their infections, and if things are going really well for them, they adopt certain behaviors. And if they're having a hard time, like if the immune response is having a really good go at them, or if their host is taking antimalarials that are killing a lot of the parasites, then they switch to certain other strategies. And over the longer term, the strategies that they adopt are the ones that maximize their fitness. So if things are going really, 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 really badly in their infection and they've got basically no chance of surviving, they put all their effort into transmitting to mosquitoes. But if things are going just a bit badly, you know, general stress and so on, then they adopt different strategies that give them a much better chance of surviving in their host. And that's a great thing to do, because over the longer term, it maximizes their fitness, because they have a much longer infection in their host. And a long infection comes with a lot more opportunities to transmit to mosquitoes and onto new hosts, which is fitness for parasites. So they're capable of paying attention, if you will, to what's going on during their infections and changing their behaviors in the ways that will maximize their overall fitness. And we know that one of the aspects that matters to them is the time of day as well. They seem to know what time of day their host is going to be having its meals, for example. And they do different things at different times of day to capitalize on the resources that they need from their host's food, because they need to get various things that they can't scavenge from the red blood cells they live in. They need to get them directly from the blood as a product of the host digesting its meals. And so they seem to be cued into this and able to respond to doing different things at different times of day, which is pretty smart and sophisticated, if you let me use these anthropomorphic terms. So like I say, you know, you see a lot of this cool stuff that animals do in David Attenborough documentaries, and we're like, yeah, malaria parasites can do that too, you know.
Yeah, I find that absolutely fascinating. That's from my understanding of parasites and pathogens from this year 12 biology, that's a completely different take on it. That's really interesting.
They are,
Are
yeah.
those,
Sorry.
Are those features conserved amongst other parasites, or just new stuff that you're finding?
Great question. Probably trypanosomes that cause sleeping sickness. They're probably capable of similar things as well. It's hard to know about other parasites because they're much harder to study. One of the great things about malaria is that it's so well studied that it's a really tractable organism to do research on. So there's lots of anecdotal evidence that lots of other parasites are paying attention to their host circadian rhythms, and they're also probably it's called plasticity, the ability to do different things depending on their circumstances. Malaria parasites are doing the same kind of stuff that animals do, that plants do. So it would be very surprising to me if they're the only parasite that can do this kind of stuff. These are very general rules for life that we take from evolutionary biology and apply to malaria. So my best guess is they apply to most other creatures too.
Sure.
But one of the things that is malaria specific that we're trying to get off the ground in the lab is, how are malaria parasites evolving in response to vector control measures? So as you'll know, for decades, humans have been deploying insecticides and using insecticide-treated bed nets to stop malaria transmission. We know that mosquitoes are evolving in response to all this. There's a huge problem with insecticide resistance. There's also reports now that, well, mosquitoes are going to die if they try and bite someone at night because they're under an insecticide-treated bed net. So what's the solution to that if you're a mosquito and you need blood? Bite them at a different time of day. So mosquitoes are now biting earlier in the evening and further into the morning when people aren't protected by their bed nets, because there's been selection on mosquitoes to solve the problems of insecticides. And so what we're wondering is, well, that's all bad, obviously, but what does it mean for malaria parasites? The kinds of mosquitoes that they're interacting with now are different to the kinds of mosquitoes they were interacting with before insecticides were widely used. What selection pressures is this putting on malaria parasites? How are they coping with this change in their transmission ecology? So we want to ask this question: is it business as usual for the malaria parasites, or not? Are they evolving in response to the consequences that vector control is having on their vectors?
I suppose this is like another big, hard to answer question. But like when we deal with all these pathogens and diseases, like, is there a way to prevent them from getting a resistance? Because it seems like all we're doing is just putting selection pressure on them. It's like, are there ways? It's like, is it just inevitable? Like, if we keep imposing those pressures, aren't they always just going to keep getting more resistant?
Yeah, history tells us it's inevitable. Every antimalarial drug, for example, has been met with resistance. You've got to look at antimicrobial resistance in bacterial pathogens. It's inevitable. The best we can hope to do is be smarter about it and slow it down. Slow down the emergence of resistance or evasion and slow down its spread across the world. And we can do this by smarter strategies. And so my approach to that is, well, if we understand why parasites do things the way they do, we can at least transfer that knowledge to understanding how they're going to cope with the interventions we throw at them. And that might do two things. It might reveal new ways that we can target them. So if we can understand, for example, how they sense their environment and make the best of it, if we understand how they do that, we could mess with their ability to do that. And we could trick them basically into doing things that are bad for their fitness, bad for their transmission. It's not going to cure the problem in and of itself, but it's another kind of arrow in the armory, if you like. The other thing it can do is at least tell us, well, how can we better use the interventions that we've got? What are the ways that we can deploy the tools that are currently in existence to impose the least selection pressure on the parasites? Rather than, using the strongest dose of drugs for the longest time possible and imposing the strongest selection pressure on the parasites, are there ways that you could get the same clinical benefits for people or reduce transmission of diseases by a good amount, but not put such strong selection on the organisms you're trying to deal with?
Sure.
So that's why public health and medicine needs evolutionary biology to make it smarter. And you're going to put me on the internet saying this.
Yeah.
I'm going to spread it around. Don't worry, it'll get out there. I suppose it fits with talking about disease. I have a very broad question. I suppose it comes from a position of just trying to learn more about the world and our place in it. Do you think it is naive to want to have an impact on society through our careers? Like, not in a big grandiose fashion or anything like that. That doesn't seem realistic. But still just orienting ourselves to like be working on something that does have like some sort of importance. Like, is that naive, or do you think that's something worth like striving for? Perhaps in a career in science or in any other career. What do you think?
I think, I mean, I guess I selfishly think people should follow their interests, no matter what they are, as best they can. But I think it is really great when those two things coincide, when you want to do something that you're interested in and you also happen to think that it's important and valuable for the world. And that, I think, is a massive reason why people want to join my lab, is that they do like the idea that, okay, so what we do is clearly never going to directly lead to a drug or a vaccine, but some of the stuff we do can feed information into how these things might be developed or deployed. If those people wanted to listen to us, then it could. So yeah, and so I think that that's great, and should be encouraged for sure. If you can answer the same research question on a model system that nobody really cares about for its applied relevance, or you could answer that same question in a system where you might have some impact on medicine or conservation or agriculture or something, then why would you do it in the standard model system? Why wouldn't you take the opportunity to do something and make it greater than the sum of its parts?
Sure, yeah. Also, this might be like unique to science, but it also seems to be like there's a bit of chance in play, because say that you might be researching something that's out of fashion, but then it turns out to have like a really important effect. Like I'm thinking of CRISPR-Cas9, because like that seems unfashionable to be studying bacteria, but now it has this like huge effect that's like sort of like revolutionizing genetics. Like, is there anything you can say about that? Is that like a hope of scientists, or is that just like purely left to chance? What do you think?
I guess, well, speaking personally, that would be massively serendipitous if something like that were to come out of my lab. That is not something that we would ever plan for, I don't think, but maybe some people do. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, that what you've just described does underscore the importance of serendipity and blue skies research. And it's probably important to point out that as much as I've said good things about the way funding agencies are going, one of the bad, in my view, directions that things are going is much more of an emphasis on research that could have applications. So, like I say, why would you answer the same question on a system with no relevance when you could do it in a system with relevance? You get money for doing this, you wouldn't get money for doing that. However, the problem with that is that, well, maybe if you were working on this obscure model system that nobody cared about, maybe you would come up with the next CRISPR. The value of blue skies research is often that we don't know where it's going to lead, and that's getting harder and harder to get research funding for.
What does a typical day or week in your life look like? Like what kind of like things you do on like a day-to-day or week-to-week basis? Like, are you able to do much lab work or hands-on research?
Not anymore. There's a bit of a joke that it gets posted on Twitter whenever I'm drafted into the lab to do something useful. But I still maintain there are things that I can do that that I can do more quickly than other people in the lab. So I still think I have some use to everybody. So it's been a bit upended in terms of what I do over the last 2 years because of the pandemic and doing a lot of homeschooling and working at home and so on. But in a non-pandemic working environment, most of my time it's interesting because I realize this is my problem and it's my old-fashioned view of my job, but in my head I should be spending all my time working with my group, helping them write papers, helping them plan experiments, having meetings with them, and teaching as well. And then everything else, like organizing conferences, running things like the Women in Malaria initiative, helping with the public engagement, all the grant reviewing stuff, all of that I kind of view as homework that has to be fitted in on top of everything else. And so it can get a bit stressful when there's a lot of all this extraneous stuff, and I don't feel that I'm putting enough time into the papers and producing PhD theses that I really feel I should be doing. However, that's, that is stupid. I know also that that's a stupid way to view things, because all those things are part of my job. And what's great about the job is that I can decide when to do those different things to a large degree. Having said that though, as a lab head, you are very much beholden to the schedules of other people. So the people in my lab, they can say, I'm aiming to get you a draft of this particular paper on this particular day, but we've never written that paper before, so we don't actually know how long it's going to take to do that. And so often schedules for when I will be expecting to work on stuff isn't quite how it pans out, and people might be working to deadlines, and so that means then that I've got to drop everything to focus on their stuff at a time when I perhaps been expecting to do something else. So you're kind of, I would say you're at this point in my career, I'm largely playing catch up with things and working to the schedules that other people impose on me. Having said that, I could probably change that if I were a bit more draconian, but that's not how I want to work, so I don't do that. I have a lot of meetings, do some teaching. I don't do very much teaching, but teaching is fun, and I do enjoy it. And then, there's various sort of, I guess, community duties that I do, like reviewing lots of grant applications and sitting on funding panels and helping organize conferences and stuff. There's quite a lot of that goes on. So yeah, occasionally I have to help sample and experiment or dissect thousands of mosquitoes if we're in a busy experimental period. So that's always nice to appear on Twitter as rare sight PI in lab.
So we're getting to the end of our questions list, and one thing that we want to ask everyone is what advice you would have for young people, like both in life and like in terms of careers and science. What do you think we need to hear?
Okay, so I will reiterate that I do not think you need to hear, you must be impressive all of the time.
Sure.
Yeah. So I mean, you guys are clearly, you're clearly well ahead of the curve in that you're really thinking about all of this stuff, which is amazing. You know how to develop an international network because you've been contacting people globally and talking to them, building your contacts. This is all amazing. So you guys, I think, are really well set. You know what you're doing. And you just need to carry on doing what you're doing, basically, and everything will be tremendous. I think it's really hard to know precisely what you're going to want to do at this stage. As you've said, you're expecting that your interests will become clearer as you progress through your careers, which is completely the way it normally works. So I think, the best thing you can do is give yourself opportunities to do lots of different things. Try and take hold of opportunities when they come by and exploit them for whatever you can get from them. Don't be afraid of throwing your hat into the ring and seeing what comes out. If you have an opportunity to do something that seems like a good idea on paper, take it, even if my father once told me when I was a child, if you're frightened of doing something but you think it's a good idea to do it, just try and get over the fear and do it anyway. And I've tried to live by that as my sort of life rule, and I think that's good. It stops you from allowing a lack of confidence stand in your way, or stand in my way. Anyway, that's how I've got over that issue. So yeah, be open-minded, take opportunities where you find them, create opportunities like you're doing right now, and just try and have some fun because you're young.
Yep. And as our very, very last question, we are in this process of researching and contacting international scientists as well as domestic. We want to gather a sort of a, what you can call it, a quote book from each scientist. Maybe get one quote or maybe one or two sentences if they're interested to that. They want to add to this quote book. So please do so as well if you want to. One or two sentences of any quote that you like us to add to this quote book.
Can I think about that? Because
Yeah, of course.
there's a
Yeah,
lot of I think it depends what you want the quotes to be about. Do you want them to be about what it's like to be in academia, or what it's like to be a scientist, or advice for getting from where you are to getting where I am? I think it what I would say would depend on what you want it to be used for, to illustrate.
Maybe you could say a word of wisdom, then that could be academic, non-academic, in life and in general.
Okay, how about I'm rubbish at coming up with stuff like this off the top of my head, as will be clearly apparent. Yeah, how about don't be afraid to take the opportunities and create opportunities for yourself. Be imaginative and open-minded and confident in yourselves.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor. It's a very good meeting. I'm very, very glad to have met you.